The philosophy of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin does not present itself in the traditional manner of a published manifesto, a treatise, or a carefully codified doctrine. Unlike Marx, Lenin, or even liberal theorists of the West, Putin has rarely articulated his worldview in abstract categories of political thought. Instead, his philosophy emerges from lived experience embedded in the institutions that formed him, the crisis that scared him, and the state structures he has reshaped in his own image. To understand Putin philosophically, one must look not for systematic theories, but for the underlying principles guiding his decisions: sovereignty, stability, dignity, and control. These values were neither invented in isolation nor drawn from utopian imagination. They were distilled from the disciplined secrecy of his years in the KGB, the disorienting trauma of the Soviet collapse, and the chaos of Russia in the 1990s. His early presidential terms, often remembered for their pragmatic blend of liberal market economics and tight political centralization, were the laboratory in which these convictions were translated into a governing philosophy. This essay will explore the formation and substance of Putin's philosophy, with special attention to his time as a KGB officer in East Germany, his reactions to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and his political practice during his early years in office. It will argue that Putin's worldview cannot be reduced to opportunism or nostalgia. It is instead the product of a distinct intellectual evolution rooted in the conviction that order, sovereignty, and state continuity are the supreme goods of political life. Putin's career began not in the free marketplace of ideas, but in the secretive holes of the Soviet intelligence service. To serve in the KGB was to enter a community that prized loyalty, self-effacement, and the subordination of the individual to the needs of the state. For Putin, this was not simply a profession, but a moral education. The young officer internalized the ethos of secrecy, the conviction that information was a weapon, and the belief that history was shaped not by masses or ideologies, but by the disciplined few who could act decisively in moments of crisis. This training inculcated a distrust of uncontrolled openness and a suspicion of disorder that would remain central to his thinking long after the Soviet Union itself had dissolved. His posting to Dresden, East Germany, during the late 1980s proved particularly formative. Here, Putin was stationed in a satellite state that embodied the tensions of the Cold War. Dresden was both peripheral and fragile, and as Soviet authority began to wither, he found himself watching a collapsing order from the inside. The moment that would leave the deepest mark came in 1989, when East German crowds stormed the headquarters of the Stasi. Putin, seeking instructions from Moscow, discovered silence. The Soviet Union, once the guarantor of stability, had no will to intervene. For a young officer trained to believe in the omnipotence of state power, this moment was nothing short of existential. The lesson was etched deeply into his worldview. A great power that hesitates, that shows weakness, invites not compromise, but disintegration. The philosophy of sovereignty as survival, which would later dominate his presidency, was born here in the ruins of East Germany, not from abstract speculation, but from lived humiliation. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 was, in Putin's own words, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. This phrase has often been misinterpreted as a lament for communism or Marxist-Leninist ideology, but a closer reading reveals that Putin's concern was not ideological. His grief was for the collapse of order itself. For him, the Soviet dissolution represented the loss of security, dignity, and sovereignty. Tens of millions of Russian speakers were left stranded outside the borders of the Russian Federation. The economy entered freefall. The state apparatus appeared incapable of ensuring stability. The empire that had once guaranteed his identity as a servant of a great power had vanished overnight. This trauma hardened several core convictions that would guide his future philosophy. First, he came to see sovereignty not as a legal abstraction, but as the existential foundation of a nation. Without sovereignty, a state becomes vulnerable to predation, its people humiliated and its identity erased. Second, he developed a deep suspicion of rapid liberalization, associating it with the chaos of the 1990s, when Western economic models were imported wholesale into Russia with disastrous consequences. What the West celebrated as transition, Putin experienced as collapse. Third, he internalized the belief that only a strong central authority could hold a vast and diverse nation together. The decentralization of the 1990s, when oligarchs and regional governors wielded power rivaling that of the Kremlin, seemed to him proof that weak institutions inevitably give way to disintegration. In this crucible of defeat, Putin's philosophy was not nostalgic for communism, but oriented toward ensuring that Russia would never again experience such a loss of dignity and cohesion. After leaving the KGB, Putin entered politics in St. Petersburg. Working under Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, it was here in the turbulent early 1990s that he began to apply his philosophical convictions in the messy reality of post-Soviet governance. Sobchak was a reformer who championed markets and democratic institutions, and Putin, as his aide, was exposed to Western investors, liberal intellectuals, and the mechanics of municipal government. Yet what he observed reinforced rather than weakened his central lessons. Reform was fragile, markets could be corrupted, and democracy without discipline risked degenerating into chaos. The world of St. Petersburg politics was rife with corruption and criminality. Putin saw firsthand how unregulated liberalization created oligarchic capture, and how foreign investors exploited Russia's weakness. At the same time, he also learned the necessity of pragmatism. Deals with businessmen and foreign companies were sometimes the only way to keep the city functioning. Thus was born the dual aspect of his philosophy. Embrace openness when it strengthens the state, but reserve the right to restrict it when it threatens stability. This pragmatism distinguished him from rigid ideologues and would later allow him to maneuver deftly between cooperation with the West and confrontation. depending on circumstances. By the mid-1990s, when he moved to Moscow and entered Yeltsin's circle, Putin had already established a reputation for loyalty, efficiency, and discipline, qualities that marked him as a man shaped less by ideology than by conviction in the necessity of order. When Putin assumed the presidency in 2000, Russia was weakened, fragmented, and demoralized. The economy had collapsed in the financial crisis of 1998. The military had been humiliated in Chechnya, and the authority of the central government was openly challenged by oligarchs and regional governors. In this context, his philosophy translated into a program of restoration. His central priority was to build what he called the vertical of power, a reassertion of federal authority over the vast Russian territory. Governors who had previously wielded near-sovereign powers were brought back under Kremlin oversight, and oligarchs were either co-opted or sidelined. This philosophy of centralization was coupled with what he termed managed democracy. Putin did not abolish elections or political competition outright, but he placed them within a framework that guaranteed stability. Political pluralism was permitted, but never at the expense of cohesion. His approach reflected the hierarchy of values he had internalized. Freedom was meaningful only when grounded in order, and order was non-negotiable. Economically, he embraced markets but with a statist framework. Energy, defense, and banking were placed under state influence, ensuring that strategic sectors could never again fall entirely into private hands. Markets were not abandoned, but they were reinterpreted as tools for strengthening sovereignty. Equally significant was his insistence on restoring Russia's dignity on the international stage. His early foreign policy was cooperative. He sought partnership with Western powers, even supporting the United States after the September 11th attacks. But cooperation, in his view, had to be based on respect. Russia would engage with the world as an equal, never as a subordinate. If engagement meant dependency, then disengagement was preferable. Here again, sovereignty was the guiding star, shaping his approach to both domestic and international affairs. Underlying Putin's philosophy is a distinct conception of sovereignty that goes beyond traditional international law. For him, sovereignty is cultural as much as political, existential as much as territorial. A truly sovereign state must control its own resources, resist external interference, and preserve its cultural cohesion. This conviction explains not only his suspicion of Western-led globalization, but also his view of history and tradition as instruments of legitimacy. He often invokes Russia's past, drawing selectively on the grandeur of the Tsars, the sacrifices of the Soviet people, and the moral authority of orthodoxy to construct a narrative of continuity. History in this philosophy is not a museum, but a reservoir of strength that can be mobilized to unify the nation. This framework also extends to his conception of duty and ethics. Unlike Western liberalism, which often foregrounds rights, Putin emphasizes responsibilities. Citizens, he argues, owe loyalty and service to the state, which in turn provides protection and stability. This ethic mirrors the KGB's emphasis on duty and the subordination of the individual to the mission. It is attractive to those disillusioned with the perceived chaos of the 1990s, but it also comes with costs. Personal liberty is often subordinated to collective security, and dissent is interpreted not as democratic vitality, but as potential vulnerability. Perhaps the clearest expression of Putin's philosophy is the binary opposition between order and chaos. His life experience taught him that chaos is the ultimate evil. He saw it in Dresden when the Soviet Union hesitated and the regime collapsed. He saw it in the 1990s when unregulated liberalization left Russia humiliated and impoverished. He saw it in the disintegration of the USSR when borders dissolved and identities were fractured. In each of these moments, chaos was the enemy and order the salvation. Thus, while liberal traditions often elevate freedom as the supreme good, Putin elevates stability. Freedom is desirable, but only within the parameter of order. Prosperity is valuable, but only when it strengthens sovereignty. Diversity is tolerable, but only when it does not undermine unity. This philosophy does not lend itself to utopian visions of revolutionary projects. It is defensive, pragmatic, and rooted in the conviction that survival comes before aspiration. The philosophy of Vladimir Putin, as it emerged in his early years as a KGB officer and in his first presidential terms, is a philosophy of survival, sovereignty, and stability. It was forged in the crucible of collapse and shaped by institutions that prized secrecy, discipline, and control. It rejects utopian ideologies, whether communist or liberal, in favor of a pragmatic hierarchy of values: order before freedom, sovereignty before integration, dignity before compromise. To understand Putin in his philosophical terms is not to endorse him, but to see the coherence beneath the pragmatism. His philosophy is not the abstract theorizing of a political philosopher, but the lived worldview of a statesman who believes that weakness invites disaster, and that only a strong state can protect its people from chaos. It is a philosophy born of trauma, sustained by pragmatism, and defined by an unyielding belief in sovereignty as the foundation of political life.